I want to welcome our witnesses. Glenn Tiffert, Glenn, distinguished research fellow at the Hoover Institution. Sarah Cook, senior advisor for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at Freedom House. And Adam Kohler, who is president of Pamir Consulting and former assistant director of FBI's Counterintelligence Division. Alan, I think this is the first time you have appeared before the committee in not in an FBI standpoint, but we welcome all, but a particular welcome back for Alan. Let me also say, while I'm grateful for Senator Heinrich being here on time and Senator King almost on time, as usual, we're doing, when it is open hearing, we go by seniority. So if Ron Wyden slides in a couple minutes before, don't take it out on me personally. The purpose of today's hearing is to better understand the PRC's malign influence strategy targeting the United States. This builds on long-standing efforts by this committee to track and expose malign activity by our nation's foreign adversaries. We try in this committee to help educate the public, warn social media platforms and news media, and enhance, frankly, interagency cooperation. Because the truth is, we need that, not just whole of government, but whole of society, to be able to recognize, acknowledge, and counter the PRC. The PRC's influence efforts are so widespread. This hearing will focus on two important vectors. One, the PRC's efforts to influence U.S. policy, particularly by targeting local and state levels, something that Senator Rubio was probably the first member on the committee to bring to our attention. The second is the PRC's tactics to shape U.S. political discourse and the media environment in their favor. In addition, the witnesses will discuss an area of increasing concern, what the U.S. government refers to as transnational repression, how the PRC is targeting U.S. nationals whom they perceive to be threatening to their narrative or to their interests. While the PRC is engaged in global influence operations for years, they have supercharged their efforts recently at the state and local level, using foreign investment and business opportunities as points of leverage to impact U.S. political process and to reduce the United States' criticism of China. And again, when I say China, my beef is with the PRC and Xi Jinping and their authoritarian leadership, but it's not with the Chinese people. Confronting this behavior is especially challenging because frequently, some of these activities don't fall into a classic illegal category. Lobbying, people-to-people exchanges, overt propaganda, trade deals, all governments engage in these activities. But what makes this different is, frankly, the scale of their efforts and the resources, methods, and organization they employ to advance these objectives, and the frequent obfuscation that occurs that covers the links between these efforts and the PRC's intelligence agencies. In both its influence and coercion activities, the PRC has focused attention on those it perceives who shape U.S. policy. And that goes from business elites, to mayors, to journalists, to even folks at think tanks. In addressing this challenge, the United States must not make, as I mentioned earlier, the mistake of linking Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, or the people of China with the Chinese Communist Party's efforts. Frequently, it is these individuals, particularly the Chinese diaspora, who are victims of the CCP's efforts, as we've seen most recently with specific targeting by the CCP of a Chinese American candidate for office in Congress. As vice chair and chairman of the committee, one area that has been particularly alarming to me has been the ability of foreign adversaries to harness U.S.-developed communications technologies. In addition, a recent report from Mandiant, the great cyber firm, has shown that the PRC is successfully adopting the Russian playbook, for instance, using Western gig economy platforms to hire Americans to draft newswire content, stage protest, and artificially amplify political content on social media. In the case of the PRC, we've seen not only extensive efforts to manipulate American social media platforms, but also to extend its reach through homegrown communications projects. We've seen public research, for instance, documenting how WeChat, owned by PRC-based Tencent, has facilitated surveillance and censorship of users in the United States and Canada, again, targeting the Chinese diaspora as their main goal. An area where the Vice Chairman and I have shared concern, maybe different ideas of a path on how to deal with it, but the growth of TikTok as a globally competitive social media platform heightens these concerns. With TikTok achieving a level of US adoption, 150 million Americans, 90 minutes a day, and cultural prominence and profitability, this is an enormous challenge. And I think Senator Rubio and I were remarking in the comments leading up, to see the amount of advertising and sponsorship. Frankly, there is not a morning political cheat sheet or tip sheet that has not been sponsored by TikTok and ByteDance over the last few months. That's all fair and legal, but it does question what kind of influence they're able to bring to bear. On top of that, we recently saw reports that even TikTok employees are starting to leave in droves as more and more people from their parent ByteDance come down into the TikTok operation, I believe, to try to further some of the CCP's goals. Again, much to the complete difference of what was the TikTok, Mr. Shou's presentation when he talked before the House in terms of trying to deny that linkage between ByteDance and TikTok. And again, I point to a recent Wall Street Journal article that points some of this out. And this is, we think about all this, and that's even before we think about the enormous advent of how AI tools can literally take what we saw in past misinformation, disinformation tactics and really amplify and expound it at virtually unlimited levels. So we've got to figure out what to do. I believe still that we need an overarching legal framework which would give any foreign-based technology a day in court and rights protected, but particularly from nation states like China, Iran, North Korea, Russia, Cuba, Venezuela. I think we still need a framework on how we deal with that technology, those technologies that come in, rather than the whack-a-mole approach that we've taken on companies like the Russian software company Kaspersky, and the fact that we're still using taxpayer money to rip and replace Huawei equipment because we couldn't send an organized enough signal ahead of time. How we get there, we still got some legislating to do. I know the Commerce Department, and I appreciate Chair Cantwell, some of her efforts there. You know, I think this problem has not gone away. And we need to make sure that we continue to educate the American public and, frankly, all of our colleagues on this challenge. This has been something this committee's started working on in 2017. Together, we've hosted a series of what we call classified roadshows where we briefed industry sectors. That's important, but we also need to continue to do as much of this as possible in the open, in the public, to make sure that folks are aware of this challenge and threat. So again, I welcome you all, and with that, I'll turn it over to the Vice Chairman.
Thank you for holding this open hearing. Thank you all for being here. Many countries, both friends and adversaries, try to influence and shape American public opinion and ultimately our political process, often through their embassies, which is what they're here for. In many other cases, you know, by getting others to echo points because they want us to fund something or support something. But this, what we're facing now from China, goes far beyond anything the nation's ever confronted because we've never had a competitor adversary with these resources at their disposal and with the complexity of reach. This is not simply a pure governmental, we're all set up to think about governmental efforts. This is not just governmental. This is a whole of society, whole of economy approach to how they try to influence our policies in the United States. Simply put, you know, I think it's first important to define what it is we're talking about. We are not traditional espionage from China happening at an extraordinary rate, both against our government and against our private sector. And that's not what we're here to talk about today, although we acknowledge it exists at levels that are equally disturbing. What we're talking about here is the effort of the Chinese Communist Party to basically subdue us without fighting, to get us to a point where we are doing the things they want us to do because it's coming from within. And to do that, they've employed tactics and that we've never seen before from an adversary. Because the Russians do this, they're pretty good at it. They did it during the Cold War, but they look like children next to what these guys are able to employ and who they are able to deputize. Let's start with Wall Street, investment firms and corporations, all of whom have been deputized for decades into arguing the Chinese viewpoint of economic policy, of trade, because they're making a lot of money in China. Now, they may realize that one day they'll be put out of business once their Chinese competitor is given all their intellectual property, but for the next few years, there's a lot of money invested, and they understand that in order to have access to that market, they have to make the people that give that access happy. And so they come here to the Capitol for decades, march into the White House, and basically say, we argue what the Chinese Communist Party wanted them to argue on their behalf. It's happening to this very day. We've all heard in media, and what I mean by media is these newsletters, these print, but in many cases, whether it's they're compromising or they're trading access, somebody wants to have access to China and they don't want their visa yanked, and so they got to be careful how they report about China or what issues they focus on out of fear of that regard. In many cases, flat out buying media outlets or even injecting within normal media content paid material that can be tracked back to Communist Party efforts here in the United States. We talk about academia. They knew how to play that really well. First of all, their students that they send here pay full rate and more. In many cases, universities have partnerships. You're dealing with researchers in many cases who are used to this belief in open collaboration, even though with the Chinese, it's usually a one-way street. And then organizations on campus that they help fund that oftentimes are the first ones out there leading efforts to shut down any efforts to talk about Hong Kong or Tibet or you name it. You think about local governments, because I think they've now figured out, okay, at the federal level, there's like a strong bipartisan consensus. It's not fertile ground anymore. What is fertile ground is city halls and state capitals, where the issue's not talked about every day. And that's just easy picking, in terms of, imagine someone who comes and says, we're going to make a major investment in your state, or likewise, we're going to yank a major investment in your state unless you do what we want you to do on these policy issues. They've learned how to use that against us. Think about the NBA for a second, okay? There was a time a few years ago where you could literally wear and show up in the signs that said anything you wanted negative about America, and I mean anything, but you would be expelled from the arena if you had a shirt on that referenced Hong Kong. They would kick you out. They would literally, security guard would come and get you and tell you, you have to leave, especially if you're in camera shot, if it says something negative towards Hong Kong. That happened in the United States of America. Think about Hollywood. You will not find a major motion picture studio in America that will produce a film that has a Chinese government villain or even a Chinese villain. Why? Because the movie won't be distributed over there. And that's a big market for movies. So the list goes on and on. We could be here talking about all this. It's a big deal, and it's happening right underneath our nose, and there's not enough attention being paid to it. And as the chairman pointed to it, it's difficult because we do, at the end of the day, people have First Amendment rights in this country to speak and to advocate for positions, including those that are against our national interest. And, that's just the way it is. But this is a dedicated effort that at a minimum, the light has to come on so people can see these roaches, so people can see what's happening, what's really happening here right underneath our nose, and the impact that has on our, potentially on our society and on our willingness in the future to act. I'll close with this. Everybody worries about Taiwan, and rightfully so. There's a lot of reasons. We're not going to get into all that today as to why we should be worried, but in particular what it can mean, not just to the world order and how people view our country, but to our national security. But envision a time, if there's enough legwork they put into it, this is the narrative they're creating and they're setting up, and they're using it at our schools and our broad society, and that is that when the day comes that there is a Taiwan conflict, the first thing some people are going to ask is, why should Americans die defending some small island halfway around the world, just off the coast of China? I get it, it's bad, we should condemn it, but should we really go fight for that? Is it worth the sacrifice, both treasure and blood, to do it? That's the narrative they're already setting the groundwork for. And they're not doing it among the people sitting up here. They're doing it among the people that one day will be sitting up here, or the people that will one day be working for us, and the people that will be writing about it, the experts that will be commenting on it. So these are the kinds of things that I think that deserve a lot more attention. I'm glad we're having an open hearing on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rubio. I'm not sure if you guys agreed on order. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairman Warner, Vice Chairman Rubio, distinguished members of the committee. I'm honored to be here today to talk about China's malign foreign influence operations in the United States. At the Hoover Institution, I co-chair our project on China's global sharp power, which analyzes the myriad ways in which China asserts itself around the world. And we have three main lines of effort, malign foreign influence being one of them. China's malign influence operations in the United States spring from a conspiratorial tradition within the Chinese Communist Party that goes by the label of the United Front. Within China, the United Front seeks to mobilize, infiltrate, co-opt, or neutralize every individual or organization in society of any significance, so that they either contribute to the party's goals or are eliminated as a potential source of opposition or a threat. The party recognizes no autonomous zone of civil society. In principle, it reserves the right to supervise and control everything. And under Xi Jinping, it is exercising that right ever more intrusively. The conspiratorial logic of the United Front drives the party's behavior abroad as well, where it seeks to, as Senator Rubio pointed out, win without fighting, to make the foreign serve China. If a society cannot be free, then someone has to manage it. There's a colossal bureaucracy within the PRC party state that administers the United Front, most notably the United Front Work Department of the party's Central Committee, which employs many tens of thousands of workers at every level of administration in China, but it's more than that. Every CCP member is obliged to promote the United Front, and other organs of the party and state play important roles in advancing the United Front's goals, particularly the party's propaganda department, which supervises PRC traditional and online media and pushes online disinformation into our spaces, the Ministry of State Security, which is China's principal foreign intelligence agency, and the party's international liaison department, which cultivates relationships with foreign political parties and leaders at the national and subnational levels, especially rising political stars from around the world. These organs act directly, but they also act indirectly through a web of thousands of non-governmental organizations that operate in academic, charitable, commercial, cultural, ethnic, and religious affairs, many of which engage in work with foreign partners who have international footprints and are obliged to carry out party agendas within their spheres of work. The United Front provides a cover for espionage, transnational repression, and even abductions abroad. And we have, fortunately, law enforcement tools for dealing with those. In my remaining time, I would like very much to focus on something else. By American standards, as has been pointed out, a lot of United Front activity is lawful and falls within spheres of protected speech and association. It aims to win hearts and minds, harness the idealism and the self-interest of foreign elites, American elites, to contribute to CCP goals, create local constituencies in our societies that echo CCP talking points of their own volition, and alter incentive structures so that the costs for us of de-risking are prohibitively high. As an example of how that plays out in real life, consider the current debate over renewing our STA, the agreement between the US and China on science and technology. This activity qualifies as malign if it obfuscates the origins, sources of funding, and agendas behind it, if it trades in disinformation or misdirection, or advocates violations of law, fundamental rights, or democratic principles. Lawful but malign influence operations are among the most vexing for democratic societies to combat without infringing on our constitutional rights and liberties. The United Front contributes to a host of party goals, such as rebutting foreign criticism of China and playing up flaws in American democracy, technology transfer, co-opting the Chinese diaspora, and neutralizing dissent within it. In the United States, when it comes to malign foreign influence, U.S. states and localities are America's soft underbelly. Federalism focuses them on different priorities: local job creation and investment, for example, not geopolitical competition. The CCP is highly aware of that difference and capitalizes on it, bypassing Washington to work directly with localities where consciousness of risk and institutional capacity to manage it are far lower than at the federal level. We need to change that, not necessarily by reflexively decoupling, because realistically, most of the world will not follow us down that road, and we'd only be isolating ourselves, but rather by developing the infrastructure and capacity to make better, more informed decisions about risk and manage our engagements with China more intelligently and safely. I have 4 recommendations with regard to that, which I discuss in greater detail in my written statement. Number 1, increase funding for open source research and publication on malign foreign influence operations in the United States. We have a host of non-governmental organizations and research centers that have capacity in this area and would love to do more. Provide integrated federal support to subnational governments and businesses, single interagency touch points distributed around the U.S., perhaps through the DHS Fusion Centers or Commerce's U.S. commercial service offices. And then we need to look beyond, number three, we need to look beyond espionage and law enforcement. We need to think of strategies for staying safe drawn from public health, as well as counterintelligence and prosecutions. In particular, we need to ensure that we protect the multi-ethnic Chinese diaspora that bears the brunt of CCP malign influence operations, to ensure that they have access to the same rights, liberties, and freedoms guaranteed to all Americans and can practice them safely. And then finally, we need to address systemic as well as acute risk. Headline-grabbing incidents are important, but they should not distract us from the slow-rolling climate change that the United Front activity tries to create. The most successful influence operations are those that run under the radar. Thank you very much for your time.
Chairman Warner, Vice Chairman Rubio, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My remarks focus on the media dimensions of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP's, influence operations targeting the United States. They draw on the U.S. chapter of Freedom House's Beijing's Global Media Influence Study, which covered 30 countries across 6 regions. The CCP and its proxies influence media and information abroad in complex and multifaceted ways. These extend beyond simple propaganda or overt public diplomacy. Rather, they involve elements that are covert, coercive, or corrupting. In particular, we identified 5 categories of tactics: propaganda, disinformation, censorship and intimidation, control over content distribution infrastructure, and attempts to export the CCP's model of information control. Our research found that the United States faces a very high degree of media influence efforts from Beijing, in fact, second after only Taiwan, reflecting the large arsenal of tactics being deployed. Thankfully, the United States also displayed a very high degree of local response and resilience, earning it an overall status of resilient. In my time today, I'd like to focus on 5 aspects of this phenomenon. 1, Beijing-backed content is appearing in mainstream U.S. media. This is the most significant avenue through which Chinese state-produced content reaches large American audiences, typically through content sharing agreements, partnerships with local mainstream media, or op-eds and television appearances by Chinese diplomats. For example, FARA filings show that from 2019 to 2021, state-run China Daily paid print and online publications at least $7 million to insert their content alongside other news items. The clarity of labeling attached to such content is inconsistent and in some cases entirely absent. 2, covert tactics and disinformation campaigns are being deployed on social media. China-linked actors have attempted to pay otherwise unaffiliated social media influencers in the United States to broadcast pro-Beijing content on topics ranging from conditions in Xinjiang to, quote, saying good things about U.S.-China relations, to claims that COVID-19 originated in the U.S. deer population. Moreover, coordinated disinformation campaigns linked to China and targeting U.S. audiences are becoming more frequent and sophisticated. PRC-linked actors are experimenting with new strategies across dozens of platforms, not only regarding rights violations in China, but also domestic politics in the United States. New tactics include use of generative artificial intelligence to create images of fake news anchors, recruiting unwitting Americans to produce content, and deploying multiple layers of content laundering to obscure the CCP-linked origins. Evidence suggests these campaigns are increasing in reach, engagement, and effectiveness in some cases. 3, the use of coercive tactics is growing. Since 2019, Chinese officials and other pro-Beijing actors have aggressively restricted foreign correspondents in China, retaliated against families of US-based journalists, and launched intrusive cyber attacks against major news outlets. Pro-CCP trolls have viciously attacked ethnic Chinese journalists working for US media, especially women. More indirectly, there have been isolated instances of corporate pressure on journalists that induce censorship coming from executives, as media companies fear that certain reporting could damage their ability to reach audiences in China. 4, CCP proxies are attempting to co-opt US elites to spread Beijing's messages. One especially active proxy is the innocuously named China-US Exchange Foundation, or CUSEF. CUSEF is widely viewed as belonging to the CCP's United Front work targeting the United States. It has taken at least 127 U.S. journalists from 40 outlets to China since 2009. Another CUSEF-funded initiative since 2017 has targeted, quote, key opinion leaders in African American communities. Pro-Beijing narratives also enter the U.S. media landscape through friendly local commentators, politicians, and former officials, especially at the subnational level. In some cases, also in collaboration with CUSEF or with its funding. And 5, Beijing's influence over Chinese diaspora media is greater than many appreciate. This is especially true in the television sector and via the WeChat app owned by Chinese tech giant Tencent. WeChat is used by millions of Americans to maintain contact with people in China. Yet clear evidence exists of Beijing-aligned censorship or surveillance of these users. American news outlets and civic groups critical of the CCP, such as Radio Free Asia or Freedom House for that matter, are excluded from opening official accounts to reach WeChat audiences with their content in Chinese. Some Chinese Americans, both political dissidents and average users, have been censored for sharing content that is critical of the CCP. To conclude, the CCP's activities to influence U.S. media are likely to increase in the coming years, including in the form of social media manipulation campaigns surrounding the 2024 elections. The good news is that momentum is on democracy's side, but there is still much work to be done. Thank you.
Chairman Warner, Vice Chair Rubio, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today to discuss the malign foreign influence and transnational repression of the People's Republic of China. I appeared before this committee many times when I was an executive in the FBI, and I always have respected your efforts to both enlighten the American people and arm the government and private sector with the information and tools they need to make the sound decisions and protect their most valuable assets, ideas, and people. That was a priority for me as well when I worked at the FBI, and now providing clarity and confidence to American businesses is a critical goal in my new role at Pamir. References to China throughout my remarks today refer to the Chinese government, which is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. I do not believe, nor does the FBI, that the Chinese people are our adversary, and we certainly do not believe the Chinese Americans are a risk. To the contrary, they are at risk. Chinese Americans are often the targets of the Chinese government's harassment, and they deserve all the protections the U.S. Constitution affords them. The Chinese government, run by the Chinese Communist Party, is a threat to the American way of life. The Chinese Communist Party pursues every possible avenue to destroy our free and fair society, challenging international norms, stealing our innovation and jobs, and eschewing transparency, fairness, and reciprocity in its attempts to undermine the United States. China is engaged in a broad, diverse campaign to influence U.S. society and our leaders, to force alignment with Chinese economic and policy interests, and ensure the stability of its own political system. When those influence efforts are subversive, undeclared, coercive, or criminal, they fall into the category of malign foreign influence. And when the PRC government uses threats to achieve their influence goals, they are engaging in transnational repression, a term used to describe actions by foreign governments to silence, intimidate, harass, and even kidnap or murder dissidents who dare to criticize them. China's approach to influence in the United States is to target broadly and use multiple vectors to achieve their goals. Their efforts to influence are directed not only at the federal government. The Chinese government has found subnational level influence to be a successful tool in their effort to manipulate the environment to their advantage. Subnational leaders are often more focused on things such as job creation, capital investment, and cultural exchanges, and less attuned to the methods of Chinese political influence operations. Countering malign foreign influence and transnational repression are among the highest priorities of the FBI and the United States government. And the FBI leads the effort in 3 ways. First, through active and innovative investigations and robust intelligence collection, the FBI neutralizes threats and imposes consequences on those who would do us harm. China-related investigations now make up approximately 50% of all counterintelligence work, well over 2,000 active investigations, which is equal to the threat from all other countries combined. Second, partnerships are a hallmark of the FBI's work, and counterintelligence is no different. United States government agencies must collaborate and coordinate efforts to achieve a whole-of-government response to the whole-of-government attack from the government of China. Next week, the National Counterintelligence Task Force will celebrate its 4th anniversary, and the Foreign Influence Task Force its 6th anniversary. Those multi-agency teams use the capabilities, authorities, and resources of nearly 50 agencies to achieve strategic objectives. These collaborative efforts must continue to be supported and expanded if we are to be successful. And third, the FBI has increased intelligence sharing and its engagement with the public and private sectors. The American public needs to know how they can be targeted and manipulated so they can recognize influence efforts and insist on transparency and reciprocity in their interactions with China. If a silver lining is to be found in the Chinese spy balloon episode from earlier this year, is that the American public could look up in the sky and see for themselves that the Chinese government is spying on them. And while a spy balloon is visible evidence, the threats from malign foreign influence, transnational repression, and economic espionage are often hidden. This hearing is one important way to enlighten the American people and make them more resilient to all the threats posed by China. Thank you again for having me. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you all for your testimony, and I think brought out some very important points. Alan, I actually want to start with you, and Dr. Tiffert made mention of this as well. I think Ms. Cook did, at least in passing. You come out of the FBI, you had monitored a lot of the efforts, like hate crimes and other things that took place in recent years against Asian Americans, and in particular Chinese Americans. Can you give us a little more flavor of that, of how the diaspora community, in many ways, not simply through discriminatory actions unfounded, but frankly by the MSS and the established Chinese spy networks, preys upon that diaspora? I'd love to hear from all of you on that.
Sure. Thank you, Senator. Maybe I'll start with a quick story. After a recent arrest of a transnational repression actor, the FBI goes out and we do our normal interviews of coworkers and people in the community. And the response we got was essentially, "What took you so long?" And that was a heartbreaking thing to hear for an agency that prides itself on protecting the American people. And really what that meant was one of three things to us. Is one, either the community didn't know who to call. Two, they were afraid to call us because they were intimidated by the FBI. Or three, they were intimidated by what the Chinese government's reaction would be. And all three of those have to be efforts that the FBI redoubles its efforts to engage and make better. And it's also an effort that the entire U.S. government needs to support what the Bureau is doing, but also find ways to reach out to these most affected communities to make them feel safe, to identify and report these problems, and realize that they're not going to feel retribution from the United States government or the Chinese government.
Want to add to that?
Right. Let me begin my answer with that, talking about U.S. campuses, universities in particular. Protecting ethnic Chinese students of all origins, not just those from China, but from the Chinese diaspora around the world who happen to be on our campuses, is critical to allowing us to deliver exactly the same education that we aspire to deliver to American students, to everyone. There's an incident from 2019 that comes to mind. You'll recall at this moment in time, many American hotel chains and airlines were under pressure from the Chinese government to remove Taiwan's designation as a country from their websites and to refer to it as a territory of China. This played out on U.S. campuses where offices of international students would often break down the number of international students that were present on their campuses from countries around the world by jurisdiction. And at one campus I have in mind, Taiwan was listed as a country along with China. There was an organized effort by Chinese students on that campus from the PRC to petition that university to remove Taiwan's designation as a country and to list it under China. Taiwanese students on campus did not share that perspective, and within Chinese language private social media channels, an extremely vituperative and unpleasant situation unfolded in which Taiwanese students on campus felt threatened and unsafe. This was raised with local university administration, who, because their due process procedures on campus required an open hearing in which the Taiwanese students would have confronted the PRC students implicated with saying some extremely threatening things to them, they felt they couldn't do that and pursue it, and so the matter was dropped. They didn't have the cover. necessary. So that's one instance in which Taiwanese students felt marginalized and threatened by PRC students over the larger political environment. Same thing affects disruptions in the classroom, but within the Chinese diaspora, especially in the business community, the effect of United Front activity is felt acutely in that firms, business people who are pro-CCP are rewarded with business. If you run a newspaper, for example, and Chinese language media in the United States has felt this acutely. Expressing positions that vary in any way from the PRC's talking points, you'll get punishment. Your advertisers will dry up. You'll lose business opportunities in China. They use the economic lever as a form of social control. And this has changed the landscape of Chinese language media in the U.S.
Do you want to add? Mike.
One thing I would say is if you look at the different, really to the credit of the FBI's work, looking at these transnational oppression cases, you see the gamut of the parts of the diaspora community that are targeted. One will be about Hong Kong. One will be about practitioners of Falun Gong. Another will be the same person, and they're running on a police station that's affecting this group. Another is somebody who's a political dissident from, related to Tiananmen. Another is somebody trying to run as a candidate in Congress who's critical of the CCP. So I think there's diversity within the community, but there's also the broad targeting of all of these different parts, sometimes different parts of the Chinese apparatus. The other thing I would say is that a group of Chinese Americans got together and actually filed a lawsuit in California against Tencent regarding the WeChat app. And honestly, looking at the stories of the plaintiffs, it's just really heartbreaking because people's livelihoods were ruined. They would be using this app to have, a business, and people would come and they share some cartoon about Xi Jinping. And one of the things I'll just read briefly from that is that that the people filing it talked about how WeChat users describe living in fear, that they or their loved ones will be punished for their postings critical of the party state, and who describe having to suppress the human urge to voice their thoughts and feelings to their social networks out of such fear, that is, to engage in extreme self-censorship. And I think Dr. Tiffert mentioned this in terms of how we really have so much to do to just allow Chinese Americans to be able to express themselves in Chinese in the United States and discuss. Some of the people were censored talking about Asian American issues with other Chinese Americans, but ended up getting shadow banned by WeChat. And so I think, I'm sorry.
Senator Rubio, but I do think, the stories and the extensiveness of which the diaspora community, not only in the United States, but around the world, follows WeChat. And sometimes any occasion where we don't make clear our differences with the CCP and Xi Jinping, plays out many-fold. Senator Rubio.
Well, there is a lot to cover. I'm sure my colleagues will cover. One of the ones I wanted to focus on, which I think has been reported on, but I want to bring it all together, is you go back February of 2020, an individual was charged with acting as an agent of the Chinese government. They worked with a private investigator and local law enforcement to target an individual to forcibly repatriate individuals to China, basically go to them and say, we know who you are, we know your family is in China, you need to come back with us or they're going to pay the price. Then in April 23, individuals connected to Chinese intelligence, Chinese efforts were harassing Chinese nationals in the U.S. They used fake social media accounts to harass and intimidate dissidents. In another similar case, 2 were charged with opening and operating an illegal overseas police station, basically, in order to monitor and intimidate dissidents and those people who were critical of the government, the Communist Party of China. In May of 23, the FBI arrested a man for acting as an agent because between 2018 and 2022, he provided Chinese intelligence officials with information on Boston area individuals and organizations that included photographs of and information about these folks and so forth. From all of this, and these are the ones we know of, there's obviously ongoing investigations and the ones we still don't know about. It's fair to say that the Chinese Communist Party has an active effort inside of the United States to target and harass people, to either silence them or to get them to go back to the country by using whatever leverage they can, including threatening their families back in China. That's happening in the United States. It's not happening in Australia or Canada. We're talking about here. That's correct?
Senator, yes, you just read off many of the recent examples of transnational repression activity that the FBI has investigated in the last 3 or 4 years.
So then let's pivot now to the business community, how the tactics they use there. So I'm just going to go through a couple here. Which I mentioned the NBA one. Obviously, you know, this general manager for an NBA team put out a statement in support of Hong Kong. Chinese companies immediately suspended ties with the team, and the Chinese Basketball Association and the NBA's partnership, you know, terminated for a while. I'm sure that cost them a bunch of money, and they were upset about that. We have the Department of Justice charged the China-based Zoom executive because they were disrupting video meetings that were being hosted by users that were commemorating the '89 Tiananmen Square massacre. And this is the one I think is most interesting because it was out in the open. And in 2021, PRC officials told U.S. business leaders who had business interests in China to speak up and speak out and push the U.S. government to pursue a rational and pragmatic policy towards China. Interpretation there is push what China wants in our policy. But this is the line that really got me, adding, the business community cannot make a fortune in silence. So that's our business community. And then this is the one that I really want to ask you about because I don't think enough attention has been paid to it. This is the National Counterintelligence Security Center noted in their report. It states this, I'm just to quote, leaders at the U.S. state, at the state, local, tribal, and territorial levels risk being manipulated to support hidden PRC agendas. Without, you can cite a specific case, or perhaps you can describe a hypothetical that rings true. What does that mean? So people watching or who will watch this video clip will understand, because I think a lot of people on a city council somewhere are like, why do the Chinese are not going to be targeting me? But they do. Why and how?
So we have examples at the state and local level, for example, of legislatures being approached by individuals who ask them to include statements of support for PRC policy. In local and state legislation, we have multiple instances of city relationships in which the agreements between an American city and a Chinese sister city were written in such a way to endorse PRC policy on Taiwan in distinction from actual U.S. policy. There's an example, for example, from 2019, the city of Rockville, Maryland, had a pre-existing relationship with a sister city in China and was contemplating signing a similar arrangement with Taiwan. Diplomats from the PRC embassy here in Washington went to Rockville and said, you can't do that because you've agreed to certain principles in your original agreement with us. And they dangled investment opportunities in front of Rockville and tried to get them not to sign that sister city agreement with Taiwan. Fortunately, the city stood firm and that agreement went forward. So we have multiple examples of them trying to sneak language into documents that are signed or authored by local governments and legislatures that support and endorse PRC policy.
I spoke a little bit about CUSIP. Part of what happens is that the CCP works through multiple different levels of proxy. So I was going through FARA filings for some of our research, and you see this foundation that has this innocuous name, but actually has a bunch of people who are linked to the United Front and the former Hong Kong government heading it. They work through a local PR firm, and those are the contracts that are filed. That local PR firm will reach out to individuals from various different communities to invite them on trips to China. And so you're getting an invitation you don't necessarily, people might not necessarily think. And one of the ways they actually phrase the contract with this, the goal of creating, building, enhancing, and retaining positive relationships with key opinion leaders. In this case, it was in African-American communities, students from underserved communities, and African-American media outlets. But they specifically say that the goal is to have those individuals formulate personalized perspectives that can be articulated as, quote, balanced opinions when presented with Sino-U.S. relationship issues. So you have a situation where there's this cultivation of relationships of people who are non-experts and may, reasonably go on this type of trip. But really the purpose behind that is for them to come back and, as Senator Rubio said, to be articulating points of view regarding U.S.-China relations that align with the CCP's goals.
Thank you, Chairman. The National Counterintelligence and Security Center noted that as part of PRC efforts focused on state and local governments, the PRC collects personal information about current officials to target them for future exploitation. Mr. Kohler, how broad are those kinds of efforts? And Can you cite any specific examples of how the PRC is collecting and exploiting personal information of either state or local officials?
Thank you, Senator. A couple examples I can give. So the PRC has embraced technology in a way that other intelligence services in other countries have not. So other hearings I'm sure you've heard about, their massive intelligence collection capabilities, their cyber capabilities, and all the hacks that we've experienced over the last couple of years, where most likely, if you're an adult in the United States, the Chinese government has collected your information. They can then use that information, overlay artificial intelligence on it, for example, and they can identify who your friends are, who your contacts are, who your business dealings are, and then they can exert pressure on those individuals to then try and influence you in a decision that you're making. It's not a perfect system that they've created. We see them making mistakes, sort of overemphasizing who they think may have influence on somebody. But their intent is clear. They are trying to influence the decision makers indirectly through people in their sphere, and they're identifying that sphere through the collection of information on all of us every day.
Anyone want to add anything to that? Dr. Tiffert?
Yeah. There are Chinese firms and proxies who are harvesting data from the data providers that collect all of our personal information data in the United States and offer it for sale for marketing purposes, advertising purposes. Chinese proxies are acquiring that information too because it is for sale in the United States and the safeguards are not in place. More than that, we have a really unequal, unlevel playing field in their engagements with the subnational level, simply because they have a vast apparatus whose job it is to collect information on every elected official at the state and local level that they plan to engage with. And we are completely outgunned when they meet with our local elected officials and our business leaders. They have fully briefed dossiers on all of them. And frankly, our side has very little.
Ms. Cook.
I would just add to that even on the open source side, they're looking at what different officials at the local level or who might be, what their positions might be. And there was one 2019 think tank study by a Chinese think tank that actually categorized U.S. governors as being either, quote, friendly or, quote, hardline or, quote, ambiguous. And you can take that for what it is in terms of the assessment, but clearly that that's how they're approaching and navigating and processing some of this data and information.
I know Microsoft recently reported that PRC influence campaigns on social media are increasingly leveraging generative AI technologies to create content for those operations, which allows them to create deceptive content much more quickly, much more effectively, and to spread that content. For any of you, talk about what you're seeing on this front from your perspective. Dr. Tiffert.
So up until recently, PRC online influence campaigns were characterized by very, very high quantitative volume, but relatively little genuine engagement from real audiences. The generative AI is changing that. It's simply more appealing content visually, and it's generating higher numbers. And this is extremely alarming because in the last midterm elections, there was evidence that PRC online disinformation campaigns were beginning to create and misrepresent themselves as US voters for the first time. And when you put those pieces together, I think it portends very poorly for the next election. That they're honing their techniques to create straw US voters and generative AI content. It's something we need to watch very, very, very closely.
Ms. Cook.
I would second that, and I would add that sometimes what you're seeing is that there isn't necessarily a favoring of one side of the political spectrum or another. It's much more to sow discord, to sow distrust. And when you go through all of the different disinformation reports and the Google's YouTube takedowns, this isn't just one isolated incident. I think we see certain things getting headlines. This has been happening again and again over the last 2 or 3 years. This element of masquerading as U.S. voters across political spectrum is trying to get people to reshare content, particularly on divisive political and social issues in the United States. It's not just about Taiwan or Hong Kong or Xinjiang, though they do that too.
And I would just point out, having looked at the ads that were paid for from in rubles in the election just a few years ago, that is what I see, the targeted ads in my state again and again. That was obviously not China, but it was the same thing. It was sow discord, sow discord, sow discord. And a strong, the more divided we are, obviously, the more relatively powerful they become. So I think there's a good lesson for all of us in that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a question for all three of you, and that is following up on the questions of my colleagues. Do you assess that the Chinese government has been successful in changing a policy outcome? If I could have each of you respond. We'll start with you, Doctor.
So I think if you approach that question from the perspective of, has it been successful at changing the incentive structures by which American actors operate in their calculations of self-interest, then I would say absolutely yes. Consider, for example, the rulemaking around the Chips and Science Act and the export restrictions with regard to semiconductors, and how American firms have lobbied very strongly to maintain market access to China because it's extremely important for them. China does not need to insert itself directly into those consultations because the American firms' interests themselves point in that direction. Likewise, I think the effort to harness local business associations to effect legislation before Congress on trade and human rights in 2019 that Senator Rubio alluded to, I think is also significant in that regard.
Thank you. Ms. Cook.
I don't know if a specific example or policy was altered, but sometimes it will affect whether something even gets voted on. There was an incident a few years ago at the California legislature where there was a representative who introduced a bill about human rights in China and religious freedom, I think specifically related to the persecution of Falun Gong. And a letter was sent from the embassy to all of the legislatures, essentially implying harmed economic relations if this were to go through, and it got killed in one of the committees and didn't come up for a vote. And the representative who sponsored it was posting videos on social media, livid that this had happened, that there had been that type of interference. But I think the question of whether they're having an impact, a real-world impact, it goes beyond that. In one case, in a June 2020 speech, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien talked about how some of these conspiracy theories about how COVID, would originate in the U.S. actually meant that there was a soldier and her family in Maryland who needed security protection because people thought that she was the person who had brought COVID to China because that was some of the conspiracy. So I think you see other ways in which this creates dangers and real-world implications.
Thank you. Mr. Kohler.
Thank you, Senator. And I think my co-panelists are probably more experts on this topic than I am, but I will point out, though, I think in terms of if you see China's pivot away from focusing on the federal government into the subnational level, it may indicate that they feel like they haven't had as much impact at the federal level, but they do feel like the softer targets are at the state and local level, so that's where we see them moving now.
Thank you. Dr. Tiffert, I noticed that you serve on the Executive Committee of the University Research Security Professionals Association, and I congratulate you for that. 2 years ago, I encouraged the University of Southern Maine to terminate its Confucius Institute. And the FBI was helpful in providing a briefing on that. And the testimony of CIA Director Burns was also extremely helpful. However, we keep receiving briefs that Chinese influence within our universities has only increased through direct grants, sponsorships, fellowships, exchanges, all of which sound wonderful and sound like it builds great relationships, etc. Commenting in regard to our university's research programs, I want to ask you, how much of a national security threat does China pose with its presence in our schools?
So I think I can answer that in a couple of ways. Number one, it's about changing narratives. Increasingly at the Hoover Institution, We have dialogues in China that are frank and open within closed doors, because there are individuals who are American experts on China who feel like it's no longer possible for them to preserve their access to China by speaking freely. And so they would prefer not to go on the record or on camera. And that's how they preserve their freedom within a safe space to speak. This would not have been true 10 or 15 years ago to the same degree. So China is affecting the discourse in America about China in ways that favor its policies. Secondly, with regard to science and technology, I would say there is real risk there, and we at the Hoover Institution have documented it in ways that show how universities and researchers linked to China's military for many years had free access to US universities because no one was doing the basic due diligence to understand who they were partnering with. This is something that Senators Warner and Rubio have spent a lot of time also helping raise consciousness about. That problem still exists significantly, and unfortunately we don't have a really good grasp on it because there's not been the data collection yet to understand the scale of it and exactly where it exists. It's an area that we at the Hoover Institution are putting a lot of effort into.
Thank you.
Senator Wyden wondered if he'd wandered into the Arctic caucus room, considering the temperature in this place.
Will be served later.
But I'm going to go to Senator Wyden next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my apologies, pretty hectic as we try to work on these issues related to keeping the government open. And I want to follow up on your testimony. And if each of you can give me a short answer, that'd be great. Your testimony indicated the Chinese government uses purchased Americans' data to target Americans. So my question would start with you, Dr. Tiffert, and go down the row. Would data privacy laws, like those that many other countries have, help protect us from the PRC's influence efforts? Dr. Tiffert.
I think the answer would be yes. Many of the problems that we experience with regard to malign Chinese influence are, in some ways, you can understand them as subsets of broader problems. And I think with regard to data privacy, that is clearly one. Senator Warner spoke about how we don't want to adopt whack-a-mole approaches. And I think up to this point, the whack-a-mole approach has been dominant. Having a strategic approach to data privacy, a strategic approach also to campaign finance is critical, I think, to really getting a grasp on the larger malign foreign influence problem.
Ms. Cook.
Sorry. Yeah, I would second what Dr. Tiffert said, and I think Freedom House would really appreciate, encourage some kind of comprehensive data protection legislation, and that would serve to also protect Americans' data, vis-a-vis, for example, what an app like TikTok or what Tencent is doing in terms of this type of privacy data collection.
Very good. Mr. Kohler.
Senator, I think anything that makes it harder for the Chinese Communist Party to get our data is a good thing. I will say, though, that they still have probably the best or one of the best cyber capabilities, so they're going to find a way to get to it one way or the other. But having a law is going to prevent our own people from selling it outside our borders.
Very good. Let me go to you, Ms. Cook, on the next issue with respect to what I consider, Senator Warner and I serve on the Senate Finance Committee, and I consider censorship, in effect, to be a trade barrier. And the same laws that crush free speech in China also prevent American companies from competing fairly there unless they censor themselves. Ms. Cook, I think it'd be helpful if you could discuss how China's censorship policies not only curtail freedom of speech, but also act as this economic and trade barrier, preventing American companies from competing in this extraordinarily large Chinese market unless they comply with CCP rules.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we think of the Great Firewall in China as blocking Chinese users from being able to access the uncensored internet. But honestly, one of the most productive uses the CCP has made has been to block out international social media platforms. And that was, 15 years ago. And create this whole ecosystem of domestic alternatives. And honestly, not only for US tech companies or social media platforms, but for a wide range of other companies, it cost many, many millions of dollars. And just one example, in the media space, back in 2012, when the New York Times ran an article that was an investigative report about the finances of then Premier Wen Jiabao, their new Chinese language website was blocked. And overnight, their stock dropped by like 20%. And I think, you see, it took time because they basically lost all of the advertising they'd been planning. This had been a huge investment for the company. And of course, that creates both costs, but as Dr. Tiffert was saying, it creates leverage as well, right? It creates, affects the incentives of how executives in particular at certain companies may think about.
Let me see if I can get a couple more in really quickly. Last year, in response to direction from the Congress, the ODNI put out a report on protecting the privacy, civil liberties, and civil rights of Americans of Chinese descent in the context of IC activities. As the IC addresses the real threat from the PRC, our intelligence had recommended greater efforts to identify and actively seek to protect bias against Chinese Americans. Is it the view of all of you that the ODNI is right, that it's critical if we're going to protect the rights of Americans? Anybody disagree?
I agree, Senator.
Okay, let's record that everyone agrees with the ODNI on that. Last point is going to be for you, Mr. Kohler, with respect to cyber attacks. Your testimony mentions the PRC's use of cyber attacks and spyware against U.S.-based political opponents and journalists and human rights and advocates and others. Can you elaborate for a moment on these operations and what recommendations you would have for additional measures that our government should be taking to protect these at-risk individuals from getting hacked by the Chinese government?
Thank you, Senator. While my expertise is more in counterintelligence versus cyber, I can tell you that the FBI is very focused on countering what China and Russia and others are doing in the cyber front. The best advice is executing proper cyber hygiene on your devices, not clicking links. It's that simple. But the effort that a nation state can put into targeting individuals to get their information is daunting, and it's almost impossible for a civilian to counter that if they wanted to. Which makes it all more important that the U.S. government does all they can do to stop these threats where they start. So to do everything they can to neutralize what China, for example, is using, and the infrastructure that they use, and the U.S. compromised computers that they use inside the United States. So that, from an FBI perspective, that's the best tool.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cotton.
Thank you all for coming on this important topic. You know, we have a hearing like this in public on this committee in part to inform the public of the scale of the threat. And sometimes when we do that, people are kind of shocked to learn about it for the first time. But there's nothing new here, right? This subterfuge, deception, influence, espionage has been a part of Chinese statecraft going back at least to Sun Tzu. Is that correct? Dr. Tiffert?
The United Front has been present for, it's been, actually Lenin is the one who gave the first name to it. And it was a strategy by which the Bolsheviks were this tiny minority party that suddenly were in a position to rule the entire Soviet Union. It worked. The Chinese said, wow, okay, let's copy that. Let's improve upon it. What has changed, I think, is the scale, the intensity, and also the levers that China has more recently, simply because it's a more powerful country that has many more resources that it can devote to this. And so the United States is what might have worked 15 years ago to resist Chinese influence is no longer working.
And I'm glad you mentioned Russia, because whether in its Soviet form or Tsarist form or now in its Putinist form, they've used the same tools always, whether it's trying to influence how the West perceives Vladimir Putin's unprovoked war in Ukraine, or the nuclear freeze movement in 1982 or 1983, or the origins of the world wars, or so on and so forth. The difference with China, especially relative to Russia, is those levers you talk about, right? It has an almost unlimited number of levers because of its deep entanglement in American society and economy, whereas Soviet Russia was more or less sealed off from the West. As you're all nodding your head, that's correct. Let me just give you like one example of how this could happen. Let's say you have a boarding school, and 30 or 40 years ago, the boarding school was populated mostly by students, say 7th through 12th grade, from within a 300 to 500 mile drive. And now today it's predominantly populated by Chinese nationals, students who are here on visas. That boarding school and its local government and its local chamber of commerce and its local economic development commission has in some ways become a de facto tool of Chinese influence, has it not? Dr. Tiffert?
I think we need to deal with this extremely carefully. We need to be attentive to where the risk is and develop the capacity to detect it. But at the same time, particularly under Xi Jinping, there's a very large segment of Chinese society that is unhappy with the direction their country is moving in. That really sees this is an opportunity for the United States to reach out to them, not only because it's the right thing to do, but if you're thinking in geopolitical competitive terms, these are individuals who have a tremendous amount to contribute to American society, and we need to remain open to that.
I agree with that, and I'm very sympathetic to the fact that the Chinese people are the first and the worst victims of Chinese communism. I also have my doubts that many people who are allowed to leave China are not somehow either an arm of the PLA or the CCP, or for that matter, still under the influence of them because their family members stay there. But it's one thing to go back to my analogy for that headmaster or the board or the local chamber of commerce to come up here and lobby Senator Collins, Senator Cotton, and Senator Cornyn on student visas, something that's directly influencing them. But we also get people in those settings who come up here and lobby on things that have nothing to do with their immediate interests, like asking us to quiet down about the genocide of Uyghurs or the oppression of Hong Kong. It's kind of like the example Senator Rubio raised, right? With Daryl Morey, the former GM of Houston Rockets. They weren't talking about market access for NBA television rights in China. They were talking about China's oppression of Hong Kong. So it's this secondary leverage that the Chinese Communist Party gets because of our economic entanglement. Ms. Cook, you're nodding your head vigorously.
Yes, I mean, I think that's one side of it. I would just add to what Dr. Tiffert was saying is I think part of it is there's an opportunity, but there is just a changing circumstance where our schools, we haven't taken as much advantage of the fact that you have young Chinese people coming here. And I've had conversations with students, and we've had, that are very upset at the Chinese Communist Party, and in some cases have the family who have experienced persecution in China, and that's one reason why they wanted to come and flee it in the United States. And I think some of what happens at that local level is this lack of preparedness, both in terms of responding if you get a request or how do you deal with this, now you're asked to do this geopolitical thing, but also how do we best prepare and protect and inform these Chinese students what are their rights under U.S. law when they're here. If they get a call from the consulate, who can they turn to if they're being intimidated or things like that? Because a lot of times they don't have that knowledge or resources as well.
Well, and I just wanted to use that one example. There are many other examples, like it could be a small privately held manufacturer who gets a key input from China. It's one thing for someone like that to come lobby all of us or members of the House of Representatives on tariff rates and trying to get an exemption for their critical input from China. It's another thing for them to come up here and lobby us on the genocide of the Uyghurs or the persecution of Christians. My point is that there are almost innumerable points of leverage that China has created that we need to educate the public about, and when they come up here and act as de facto arms of the Chinese Communist Party.
Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've spent practically all this hearing talking about the problem, and I'm interested in some of the solutions. I believe that one of the great failures of American policy going back at least 3, maybe 4 administrations is the lack of deterrence. We have been a free lunch for China in terms of cyber. The OPM hack, the egregious stealing of intellectual property, nothing ever happens as a result. Presidents talk about, we will respond in some way at some time of our choosing. It never happens. Dr. Tiffert, don't you think we need to develop a stronger deterrent declaratory policy that if you interfere in this country in illegal and malevolent ways, you're going to pay a price?
I would agree with that, absolutely. And developing tools of economic statecraft, I think, is something we need to devote a significant attention to, because obviously we want tools that fall short of war with regard to deterrence. So yes, I mean, for too long we've indulged asymmetry throughout our relationship with China. Everything from journalist visas to students to the way businesses operate, who can do business in China. There's a fundamental mismatch between a closed society, a one-party dictatorship like China, and an open multi-party democracy like the United States. This is something that I think a lot of countries are waking up to around the world.
If they want to compete, that's fine. We can compete. And I believe we can compete successfully, but if they are taking advantage of the openness of this society, vis-a-vis the closed nature of their society, there should be some response. In 2016, the Russians were involved in our elections in a big way, as this committee knows. In 2018, not as much, because General Nakasone and the NSA took some active measures with regard to what was going on in Russia, and it appeared to have an effect. Another, to change the subject slightly, you mentioned FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration. Is that something that should be strengthened, particularly as it deals with state and local officials? Thoughts?
I think there's a lot more in terms of the current, how FARA is worded, that could be enforced more as a transparency tool to uncover what's actually being done and how various CCP-linked actors are influencing or attempting to influence. As I had mentioned, that's where this comes out.
We broaden the definition because clearly they're using people that are
Yes, I think the tricky thing with FARA is that it's worded very vaguely, and there needs to be more of an update that perhaps focuses it more clearly on the type of foreign influence we're talking about, because right now it could be interpreted quite vaguely to be someone's grandmother in Canada. But I think being able to update it to better shed light on the modern forms that this type of influence takes.
Also specifically take note of the efforts to influence state and local officials.
Yes, but I think, yes.
Just Congress or
well, that's already, when it comes to who is the foreign principal and who are some of the American proxies that are engaging in this when they're reaching out to local officials, those are some of the things that are already appearing, or local media already appear in the FARA filings, but there seems like there's probably a lot more going on that isn't being reported or enforced.
So I would appreciate if members of the panel would give our committee suggestions for strengthening FARA, and it may be just greater enforcement, or it may be substantive content. Do we expect a higher level of intervention in the 2024 elections, Dr. Tiffert?
Yes.
I would say absolutely yes. And
their data, they are massive collectors of data, and using that data, they could target individual Americans with messages designed to appeal to that, if it's a fisherman or a gun owner or a racing enthusiast, they can use that data to target. Is that not correct?
that's absolutely correct. And I think we've seen evidence of that for quite some time, particularly people who have a profile because they're active in issues that touch on China. They've already reached out to them. They're already blanketing them with information. And they're reaching out to other groups too. There was a very interesting article that I think brought to light Code Pink in the United States and the very tight ties that the sources of funding that are connected to that organization have with China's propaganda apparatus. This was not always true, but China has pursued that.
Well, another question, we talked about TikTok, which is a very widely used app. By the way, I'm not sure the Chinese fully control TikTok. I think cats control TikTok.
And the internet.
But is there any evidence? I mean, what a powerful ideological tool it can be to spread subtly or not so subtly the point of view of the Chinese Communist Party. Is there any evidence that it's being used in that way? There are two issues with TikTok: data mining and ideology or persuasion. Are they using TikTok in that way yet?
Absolutely they are. And in fact, you can see evidence of that with regard to amplification of narratives that coincide with China's interests with regard to the war in Ukraine. China, and this is relatively new, is taking talking points from Russian media and simply replicating them because they align with China's interests and trying to change the way we think about a potential engagement over Taiwan.
I would say, I think in a lot of ways, WeChat is even as much of a vulnerability. And of course, it's tricky because this is particularly Chinese Americans using it. But many of WeChat users are concentrated in certain districts or certain congressional districts where there may be a large proportion of the voters. And we've seen in Canada already how the inference operation campaigns, including related to elections, have happened on WeChat. We've seen that in Australia. If I was the CCP, I honestly think targeting a campaign on WeChat would actually be lower hanging fruit than trying to, in a local race, than trying to use TikTok. So I just wanted to mention that.
Fine, I appreciate it, but I hope we can emphasize this principle of deterrence. That's been the fundamental policy of the United States in defense for 75 years, and we're not applying it in this case. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cornyn.
A few years ago, Senator Warner and Senator Richard Burr at the time and I were in Austin, Texas, and talking to a bunch of technology firms there about the counterintelligence issues relative to not just this CCP, but all other sorts of intelligence efforts targeting the United States. And I know we talked about the Cold War model, spy versus spy, but now it seems like there's no end to the creativity of the Chinese Communist Party when it comes to collecting information, whether it's coercing students who are studying here, the creation of Confucius Institutes, you name it. But I want to follow up on Senator King's questions about the Foreign Agent Registration Act. A few years ago when we passed a bill called JASTA, Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, I became aware of the fact that lobbyists hired by foreign countries don't necessarily have to register under FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act. That's, of course, designed to put everybody on notice that this is a person hired by a foreign country that then is lobbying the United States. Maybe not in the best interest of the American people, but at least we know who's paying the bills and who they're working for. But because of the commercial lobbying loopholes in that, it became commonplace for people to lobby Congress, and members of Congress have no idea who they're actually working for. In the case of the JASTA legislation, which we literally passed over the president's veto, I even had a group of veterans show up in my office and claiming to be opposed to the legislation. They were essentially financed and misled in terms of what they were actually there on whose behalf they were there, but to lobby against this bill by a foreign government. So it's just, it's insidious and it's pervasive, and it seems like it's relentless. But I know, Ms. Cook, you mentioned the updating or a bill. We actually have a bill that I'd invite you to take a look at. We'll share with you, called the Paid Off Act, which several of my colleagues, including Vice Chairman Rubio, Senator Grassley, and others have been trying to get passed for some time now, but we'd invite you to work with us to see if we're getting this right. We know that, again, these our adversaries can be very creative and relentless, and certainly willing to use any tool in the toolbox to try to get access to us and to lobby in favor of laws or against laws that they deem to be against their interest. But Mr. Kohler, you're a veteran of the FBI. Have you come across instances where foreign governments have hired lobbyists here in Washington, D.C. to come here and lobby for or against laws where, without disclosing the fact that they were actually working for a foreign government?
Senator, thank you for the question, and Senator King as well on the question about FARA. Absolutely, Senator. There's a concern that the Lobbying Disclosure Act is a loophole that allows some to influence members of Congress and others and hide the hand of a foreign government. For example, companies may come and lobby you, but they may have a Chinese Communist Party cell in their Chinese parent company, or maybe even in their United States-based subsidiary. And they don't have to disclose that to you because they're coming in as lobbyists, and they don't have to register as agents of a foreign power because they're not necessarily representing a foreign government. One additional statute I'll recommend is, well, two other points, is the 951 charge, acting as an unregistered agent, which is more of a criminal charge that does come with significant penalties for folks to do if they conduct illegal activity against the United States. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity, Senator, to talk about the need for a transnational repression law in the United States. There is activity that China is doing right now that we, the FBI, I keep saying we, I'm retired, but the FBI cannot prosecute because it is just not illegal. And three aspects of that law that I think would be important is, one is enhanced penalties for people doing criminal acts on behalf of foreign nations. Two is making illegal certain of those behaviors. For example, it's not illegal right now for a private investigator or anybody to do a surveillance of a U.S. person on behalf of a foreign country. In some states, you can even put a tracking device on somebody's car on behalf of China, and it's not illegal. We need to fix that part of it. And then lastly, sanctions would be a great aspect of that law. We need to inflict some of the consequences on the Chinese officials that are actually directing and controlling these operations. We can only do that through our sanctions. And so TNR law, my recommendation would include those three aspects.
Thank you.
It did seem when you mentioned the fact that lobbyists were not necessarily always fully forthcoming on who they're working for. I kind of thought back to Casablanca when there was a charge of gambling in the casino. You have to be of a certain age frame. Luckily, Angus laughed at that. Kirsten, my apologies for doing this by seniority. Michael, Senator Bennett.
I apologize.
Okay, you've gazumped me twice today.
If the senator from New York is the only person who'd go ahead of me, I'd be happy to yield.
I'm yielding to my senior senator, Senator Bennett.
Okay,
Go ahead.
I'll go ahead. I don't even know what movie you're talking about. No, I'm just kidding. I know. I grew up watching it too. Ms. Cook, thank you very much for your testimony. Everybody else's. You know, when the Maui wildfires killed almost 100 people and destroyed thousands of homes and buildings, we saw Chinese operatives, you know, probably run by Beijing, we don't know, spread lies across the internet claiming that the fires resulted from a secret, quote, weather weapon being tested by U.S. intelligence agencies and our military. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't some random thing happening on the internet. This was an act of sabotage, at least, or sabotage on behalf of Beijing. We saw these posts accompanied by AI-generated photographs proliferate on a variety of social media sites, including Facebook, Pinterest, Tumblr, Reddit, and TikTok in over 30 different languages. And there's been a lot of discussion. I heard some today here about lobbyists and then some talk about TikTok. I mean, it has been absolutely fascinating to me to watch a company that's wholly owned by Beijing, that's subject to the data privacy laws of Beijing, advertise on our national television about how they're the greatest friend that small businesses ever had, and Congress better not shut us down. We're the greatest friend that any is literally on these poor people that are the staff here who don't get to go home to Colorado. All of you are welcome. Over the weekend, they're stuck here instead. They have to watch an endless loop of TikTok telling everybody who's watching it in Colorado, in Washington, how great they are for small business, how great they are for our military community to drive economic growth, job creation. America, this is a wholly owned subsidiary of a Beijing company. They are saying they, quote unquote, spark good. I don't have any idea what that means, but that's their tagline. And, you know, I'm worried about the fact that, and I think others here are as well, that there are 150 million monthly American users on this platform, most of whom have no idea that it's owned by Beijing, that kids are spending in our country, I say this as a former heartbroken school superintendent, 90 minutes a day, more than 3 weeks a year on this platform, just this one platform that's owned by Beijing, that's running all this false advertising, you know, about how great they are for America. That's an amazing position, by the way, we're in, Mr. Chairman. I mean, just imagine the world of AI where we're dealing with fake you and fake me, and we've got ads coming in. This is stuff that could end our democracy, and certainly is stuff that is undermining our democracy. And it's particularly, I think, irritating to me, since I know that Beijing calls this stuff in their own country digital heroin, digital opium, I think they refer to it. And you can't, you know, I don't care how enterprising you are as a kid in China, if you want to watch, you know, cat dance videos, that's not what you're going to watch. You know, you're going to watch physics experiments and you're going to watch math stuff. And there's a reason why You know, the Chinese kids are saying they want to be teachers and astronauts, and our kids are saying that they want to be social influencers. And I'm not saying that's all TikTok or all social media or that that's the most important problem America faces, but it is a problem that America faces. And I know that you've mentioned, you know, a different Chinese social media app in your testimony, WeChat, which is owned by a Chinese company, by Tencent, and also subject to national security laws in China. You said that clear evidence exists of censorship and monitoring U.S.-backed users of the app. So how do we deal with this level of foreign influence in our media? How do we deal with a foreign country that doesn't allow us to obviously use their social media platforms? How do we allow them to undermine our institutions, understanding, of course, that we, unlike their government, are committed to civil rights and to the First Amendment and our values?
Well, I mean, I think that having a hearing like this, just for more of the TikTok users out there who might be watching, to realize that it's owned by ByteDance, which is a China-based company, and that there are, at least on the Chinese side especially, ties there, elements of the CCP that are forced to be in Chinese companies. But I think a lot of it comes down also to a wide range of safeguards, because honestly, this isn't going to be the last app. This isn't the only app globally that's owned by a China-based company. ByteDance owns a news aggregator that in Indonesia was found to be manipulating content. There's another competitor that owns a very similar app to TikTok that's in Brazil and is very popular. So I think creating this kind of a more, again, strategic and systematic ecosystem where you have levels of different auditing and transparency requirements, reporting requirements, privacy and data protection, because ultimately, honestly, and to TikTok's credit, when they've been caught, they've been fairly responsive. So after Meta came out with, there were these networks of disinformation, and they were also operating on TikTok, you did see then TikTok say, well, we took down these accounts. Are they proactively doing it? No, they're also stuck between a rock and a hard place. Anything we can do that makes them have to report these things, that creates third-party audits and assessments to help identify and nip these things in the bud and incentivize against bad behavior would be helpful, short of a blanket ban which could raise constitutional questions.
I know I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I'll just say again, the point on other countries is a really important one. And second, a reminder again, why I think what we need is a separate agency to actually do this stuff. These things are going to change every single day. They're changing. Congress is never going to figure this out. We've got to figure out how to create a body of experts that can actually deal with this stuff. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the senator from New York for her indulgence.
And the senator from Idaho is going to add, I just would add that I think on the TikTok case, there's about a dozen plus governments now that have banned its governmental use. BBC has warned any of its reporters to get off because of their ability to have their data manipulated. And for those who are watching, that was the real Michael Bennett, not a deep fake. Senator Risch.
Are you sure of that?
Exactly. Senator who?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I want to get you guys' take on this, and I don't have certainly answers for these things, but I think there's some facts out there that we should talk about. The one thing, I've got two items I want to talk about. One is the incredible influence that China has on our colleges and universities. I think most Americans have no idea that there are hundreds of thousands of Chinese nationals studying at U.S. universities. We have about 12,000 studying in China, where there's 1.5 billion people. So, and the amount of money that flows into those colleges and universities from China, whether it's as tuition for the students or contracts or just plain donations, is absolutely staggering to me. And we've tried on the Foreign Relations Committee, we've actually tried to do some things with legislation shining a brighter light on this. I mean, most Americans have no idea the hundreds of millions of dollars of Chinese money that's flowing into our colleges and universities. We don't allow foreign nationals to contribute to any of our campaigns for one reason, and that is we don't want foreign nationals or foreign governments to be having influence on policymakers on people who run the government. Why, oh why, would we allow this kind of flow of money into our colleges and universities to influence the policies of those colleges and universities, which are so important to our society? The second question I've got is, Idaho is home to the Idaho National Lab. Most people have never heard of it. It is the flagship laboratory for nuclear energy in the world. The first use of nuclear energy was done right there at the lab. We've still got the first few light bulbs that were lit with nuclear energy in 1951. It is also becoming a flagship for cybersecurity issues. So as a result of that, I'm over there relatively frequently, and I've always been struck by the number of international people that visit there. More than 8,500 Chinese nationals have visited our national laboratories this year, with, from what I can tell, zero reciprocity. These are people that came to collaborate on fundamental science initiatives. And the door does not swing both ways, it only swings one way. So again, this is something that a light needs to be shined on, that there is all of this influence, and it's just not being reciprocated. And I'd like to get your thoughts on, that's the problem. I need smart people like you to tell us how we can do something about this.
Well, fortunately, this is a problem that this institution actually has the levers to help solve.
So you're saying it is our problem, not your problem.
So if you look at the statistics and the trends in the number of Chinese students who've arrived in the United States, they were growing gradually, and then the global financial crisis of 2008 was really where was an inflection point. And this was a moment in which American states were disinvesting from their higher education systems because they were under enormous fiscal pressure. And for a number of years, the money simply dried up in our state university systems, and they turned to whoever was writing checks. And China stepped into that gap. Tuition rates went way up. Chinese are paying full freight. They're paying out-of-state tuition. So it was a very easy source of money and incredible talent to draw upon. So that was a moment, I think, that really changed the narrative there. Likewise, federal support for basic fundamental research in America has not kept pace with inflation. So again, China is writing the checks, and universities are turning to those sources as well to stay competitive. We have an opportunity to raise the resources to say, you know, look inward, look domestically, work on training kids who are coming out of our high schools instead of turning to ready-made supplies from abroad in order to solve those problems. And I think this gets to something I was thinking about when Senator Bennett spoke, and that is, with regard to the things we're talking about today, so much of the solution lies in making America better, not simply being proscriptive, prescribing activities of the PRC and the CCP, but restoring faith in our institutions, making them stronger. And I think every member of this committee shares my belief in the promise of America. You know, if we can avoid undercutting America before our own people, they will be less receptive to the propaganda that comes from the CCP.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good analysis. It may be a little over-optimistic, but I think it is certainly something we should strive for. The Chinese that come here look, and a lot of them would like to stay here, but we all know they can't stay here for obvious reasons. They leave family behind that would be badly affected. So, but our culture certainly rubs off on them to some degree. My time's up. Thank you.
Senator, just one thing to add. I have heard of Idaho National Lab. My previous job in the FBI was the assistant director for counterintelligence, and little known fact is, of all the agencies that the FBI has detailed people out to, Department of Energy has the most, and it's just to protect the national labs. So we have agents working side by side with DOE counterintelligence professionals just to protect the people and innovation at those labs and to screen the visitors as they come in.
And we're very aware that what may be the first SMR in America, maybe having at the Idaho National Lab. Senator Ossoff, and with apologies to Senator Joe Brando, I think finally gave up the ghost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the panel. I'd like to hear a little bit more from each of you on threats to defense research. across the country, of course, in Georgia with Georgia Tech, UGA, Georgia State Augusta University, many institutions of higher education conducting defense-related research, sensitive research. Please characterize the nature of the information security threat posed by PRC-affiliated actors to defense research. Beginning with you, Dr. Tiffert, please.
Thank you. I think we're at a moment in time where the old categories that we inherited from the Cold War, dual-use technologies, the way of talking about them, small yards, high fences, no longer capture the nature of the way fundamental research connects with research that could be applied towards military applications. I think, look, the war in the Ukraine has showed us that commercializable drone technology, off the shelf, suddenly can be turned into a kamikaze weapon in a way that I don't think anyone might have appreciated beforehand. So those old concepts are starting to break down, and we're not really coming up with anything new to replace them with. There are areas of fundamental research, for example, in generative AI and machine learning, in quantum technology, in chemical engineering that could be deployed to energetics, in AI models that are being used for drug discovery to improve public health, but that can be weaponized to produce better chemical weapons that are not covered by our traditional categories. And they're occurring within the domain of fundamental research right now that is being published and is being harvested by countries of concern like North Korea, by Iran, by Russia, and China. And so I'm engaged in regular consultations with those in the research enterprise and those in the funding agencies to kind of devise a new strategy with regard to managing this fundamental research. But the challenge here is that many of those in our research enterprise profit by the old system. In some ways, they rose through the ranks in it, and it's required very little of them within the domain of fundamental research to do due diligence, to understand who their partners are, to think through the social consequences of the applications of their technology, the military applications. I've documented fundamental research in, for example, AI models in acoustics that are directly being applied by military universities in the PRC. And under existing US rules, this is okay. That needs to change.
Ms. Cook.
I will say this is pretty much outside my area of expertise, but I think to Dr. Tiffert's last point is that you do see, I think, more efforts to make more awareness about this and to try to give researchers who might be looking into this the tools to understand that. And I think particularly there's a think tank in Australia that actually created a database of the different military universities in China. So if you're looking at something, you could actually, even if you didn't speak Chinese, you could actually look up and see who your partner is. So I think there's that element of how do we create resources so that if someone is more conscientious, even if it's maybe not required as part of the application process, might be actually able to find that information.
Mr. Kohler.
Senator, I think some of the changes instituted through the CHIPS and Science Act, and NSPM 33, and the NDAA have all been a really good start to trying to force or encourage universities to protect critical research. I think universities have a lot more to do in terms of applying those and having a true, robust research apparatus. And I think the engagement with the U.S. government, with the military and the private sector to help them do that is going to be a good thing in the future. One other concept that and sort of echoes what Dr. Tiffert said, the information at risk is not necessarily strictly military research or classified government secrets. And the example I have given in audiences before is just with brain science. You'll have researchers here in the United States that may be trying to come up with ways for amputees to control artificial limbs using brain science. Well, that information and that technology is being stolen by China, and they're now trying to adapt it so soldiers can launch weapons using their minds. Sounds far-fetched, but that is absolutely how China views it through their strategy of military-civil fusion.
Thank you all.
Brief question. Back to TikTok. It seems to me there may be an alternative. I think a lot of what we've been talking about today is, do the consumers know what's going on and who may be trying to manipulate them? What about something short of a ban, but a requirement if an app is a foreign-owned or owned in a foreign country, that there be a little tagline when you open the app. This app is owned by a company that's based in Beijing, China, or Frankfurt, Germany. I mean, again, disclosure, it seems to me, is a sort of middle ground here. Doctor, what do you think?
Anything that increases transparency is good.
That's exactly what I'm suggesting.
On the other hand, there's been good research, particularly on the requirements, for example, that YouTube videos list that they're funded by a state-owned media, for example, that indicates that even knowing that when viewers look at it, it doesn't materially affect the impact it has on them. The psychology still plays out in similar ways. So while I would support that, I would also say that we need to, I think, be humble about what we expect from it.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much.
And Senator, just one last comment. This may be outside of the FBI's lane, but I think that the answer to this starts in our classrooms with our children.
Of course.
We need to teach the next generation to be critical consumers of the information they take in and understand that information, regardless of the source, may be sent to them to influence them. I just don't think, even as adults, those of us who didn't grow up with devices in our hands as children, we still sometimes need to have that reminder.
We need to be better consumers of information, and digital literacy should be part of every school starting in the first grade. Thank you. Thank
and
you,
Senator King,
yeah.
I would just add, I think it goes beyond even, say, a labeling on the app, but for example, if you're talking about labeling print media of the inserts, print media tend to be better. Broadcast media, it's much harder for a news consumer to know that this is a China Radio International or CCTV footage that they're watching or things like that.
Yeah,
and I think the FCC has been trying to, I think, implement rules.
At the bottom of the ad, it doesn't help if it says Citizens for Greener Grass or something.
I would simply add, and I'm going to turn it over to Senator Rubio, and Senator Lankford is going to join us. I also think what's relevant is, when TikTok/ByteDance started to spend enormous amounts of money lobbying against either one of our efforts, and we had different approaches, saying we're trying to cut out the creativity, and I think most of us simply thought that creativity is great, but it ought to be maybe on a Brazilian platform or a French platform, or didn't even have to necessarily be an American. But the debate that's progressed since that time, that we're well over a dozen nations who've come to the same conclusion that this is a security risk, beyond the fact of the data collection, but of the ability to use and diffuse disinformation and misinformation in an extraordinarily provocative way. And I think this most recent story in the last couple of days, where literally a number of the TikTok employees who had been relying on the assurances that, and had been told as TikTok employees, don't ever emphasize their ties to ByteDance. The number of those employees that are now leaving because they're seeing this, again, undue influence being imposed by ByteDance, I believe at least implicitly or indirectly or directly by the CCP, ought to have us all take a second look. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over. My thanks, my apologies to the panel. I've got to head off. I think Senator Lankford's going to join us, but very much appreciate. And I only concern is that since we've lost 2/3 of our audience, we may have to figure out a way to pump this up in terms of making sure we keep making the public presentation.
Well, I want to, as I wait for Senator Lang to get here, I think on the TikTok one, first of all, if you turn on TV now, they're extensively advertising, and it's interesting to watch their advertising. It'll tell some great story. The one I saw today somewhere was, some veteran who was homeless or something along these lines, and how it wouldn't have been possible without TikTok. So the PR push is very extensive, but I think one of the challenges, and what I wanted to delve into a little bit is with TikTok, is explaining to people, it's not that the platform has videos, because all these platforms have videos that we would find unproductive at best, offensive and destructive and so forth at worst and so forth. It is the data and how it flows. So basically, like any other platform, in order for it to work, it has to have an algorithm, a recommender engine, that recommendation engine that basically drives what you see, right? So they need to know about you. What do you like? What are you likelier to watch? In essence, the ultimate goal is to predict what you would want to buy if you knew about it. And even though you don't know you need it, you will determine that you need it once you see it. That's the design of it. And to do that, it has to collect massive amounts of data. Under Chinese law, that algorithm that drives that engine, it is illegal to transfer that outside of China. And without that, there is no TikTok. It's just a platform without that. So what people don't understand is it doesn't matter who owns TikTok. What matters is that that algorithm is incredibly powerful and continues to work. That's what matters. And so you can store the data that drives the algorithm anywhere in the world you want. ByteDance in China has to have access to that data. And it's a massive amount of data. I'll tell you that on a couple of my devices, I have a security feature on it, and it is constant. I mean, I'm just going on regular news sites and things of this nature. It is constantly popping up malicious block, TikTok blocks. If you open up, what is the malicious block? So they're collecting data, not just from users, from all these other places. So my question really, in terms of this malign influence work, how valuable is having that amount of data, not just on the users of TikToks, but others, in the hands of an organism that ultimately, if someone knocks on the door and says, we want that data and we want you to use it a certain way, meaning we need you to tweak the recommender engine in the United States to feature this versus that, how valuable would that be primarily in a moment of impending conflict? So let's say that the Chinese let's use a real world example, this conflict with the Philippines that's going on and is escalating. And they decided that they wanted to turn that data to get people to pressure public opinion in the United States against support for the Philippines. How valuable is that data? I mean, is there anything comparable in the hands of any government in the world that's able to unleash this social engineering mechanism against a potential adversary?
The scenario you describe is the type that we think a lot about, and it's absolutely terrifying because I think that it is possible and it's conceivable that in the event of a conflict, an intense conflict with China, they would deploy those algorithms in ways that would seek to undermine our resolve. Absolutely. I am not aware of any other comparable set of data, and in particular, what is arresting is in the last several years, China's adopted data security legislation that is designed to ingest all of the world's data as much as it can and not leak any of it out. China and Xi Jinping in particular is trying to create the largest repository of data in the world so that it is available for whatever purpose the CCP would like to use it for. We need to be alert to that. It's a one-way street. For those who are talking about older metaphors, maybe Hotel California. It's a little newer than Casablanca. But.
I would just add to that is that I think what you described, Senator Rubio, it's not just about the intelligence law or the data collection law. It's about how the CCP operates. And the CCP operates like a mafia. And so even if it's not just about the law, but it's about whether they're going to do the same type of transnational repression tactics that Mr. Kohler has been talking about, they use against people, including tech executives in China, including their family. So even if a tech executive, like in all conscientiousness, would feel that including for profit reasons, it wasn't in their interest to activate this type of mechanism, the part of the concern is that the CCP would be able to apply a wide range of pressures, legal repercussions, familial repercussions against them in China to essentially potentially force their hand. And I think I think the flip side is like, how do we safeguard in terms of audits? How do we catch that this is happening? Because there's just so much opacity right now, particularly on this platform, but on the social media platforms generally, in terms of what is actually happening. What is the algorithm? Is the algorithm changing? Because we've seen how their moderation policies have also changed over time.
Senator Rubio, thank you. Thanks for being here. I appreciate very much your testimony and what you're bringing to the conversation today. I want to just set a bit of a story of what's happening in Oklahoma. In 2018, my state legalized medical marijuana. In 2019, we had the largest amount of foreign land sales in the country the next year. And what we found are tens of thousands of acres that have been purchased by Chinese nationals in my state that they then have partnered with Mexican cartels to be able to grow marijuana in Oklahoma and then ship it all over the country. We have seen a proliferation of Chinese grow operations that's happened there. That has been a shock to the system. A lot of folks in rural Oklahoma of how many places that they can't drive down a rural road because there are folks standing there with ARs at the edge of a fence saying, hey, you're not allowed down this road anymore. It's been an enormous shift that has occurred. So saying all that on the criminal side of things on it, I engaged on this and have found several other folks that are watching Chinese purchases of agricultural land around the country and have seen 100,000 plus acre increase just in the last year of Chinese purchases of agricultural land around the nation. I have a bill now called the Soil Act, which just does the CFIUS process for foreign purchases of agricultural land that are currently exempt. You can do any foreign purchases of agricultural land, and you don't have to go through the CFIUS process you have to do for technology. We have a 10-mile barrier around our military bases. I'd like to extend that to 50-mile barrier, knowing that if you're 10 and a half miles away from a military base on a high hill, you're still looking right down into a military base and with a Chinese operation that's owned. So there's a lot of questions that we have about just the ownership of agricultural land in some of the Chinese criminal activity that's actually happening in the United States, facilitating partnerships with others. My question to you, have you seen this in other areas of the country? What would you recommend on agricultural land purchases in particular, and also the Chinese criminal organizations where it seems the Chinese government is looking away, fully aware of what's actually happening in the engagement of that, but looking away to increase a negative influence on Americans by their activities here?
I can address the Chinese agricultural land piece. I would be in favor in particular of legislation that increases the capacity of USDA and other agencies to monitor sales. Right now, the reporting mechanisms that are in place have extremely weak enforcement and weak capacity behind them. So we don't actually have an accurate view, as far as I understand, of the picture of foreign land sales. And so for us to understand the scale and scope of any risk that might be there, we need to improve that. So that's one area that needs a lot of attention. Beyond just the military basing proximity issue, Xi Jinping in the last couple of years has declared food security to be a paramount interest to the CCP, because the CCP is highly dependent on foreign supplies of soybeans, wheat, other commodities as well, cooking oils. And this is partly reducing their vulnerability to the ability of the U.S. to impose economic sanctions and cut off trade in the event of a conflict. So food security is a top-line agenda item for the party. Various investment groups and Chinese conglomerates are responding to the market signal that the Communist Party sent and saying, okay, this is important to them. We're going to go out to the world, not just the United States, and begin acquiring the technologies and the know-how to enhance our ability to generate more productivity in our domestic agricultural sector. So it isn't just about SIGINT, with regard to military bases. It's also about developing farms in the United States that will have access to our seeds, to our cultivars, to our animal husbandry, to our techniques that make American agriculture so incredibly productive, so that they can learn all of that and take it back to China in the same way that they've done with other industries.
Anyone else to add to that?
I was going to say, I'm not familiar with agriculture, but when you speak about organized crime, and when we talk about some of the examples of, let's say, transnational repression in Taiwan, there are close ties, again, in terms of triads or organized crime with links to the CCP. We've seen that in Hong Kong, and years ago, attacks on people like Jimmy Lai that were done by then. And I think more recently, one of these campaigns of disinformation networks that were taken down were also using networks that were run by businesses with organized crime ties in Southeast Asia. So this phenomenon may not only be limited to the agriculture sector.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask one more quick question on it? It's about the sister cities, and I know you've talked about this a little bit as well, but this seems to be an active thing for the Chinese to now pursue cities. What are the real risks to communities? If a city says, you know what, China's a growing economy, there's business there, we're engaging with Chinese business individuals, what is the threat to a community in one of these sister cities relationships, and who are the Chinese sending to the United States in that sister city relationship?
So there are a couple of threats. Number one, it undercuts American national foreign policy. A lot of these sister city agreements, the Chinese would like to assert claims and assertions about what U.S. policy is or isn't with regard to Taiwan, perhaps other places beyond that too. That's the prerogative of the federal government, first of all. So we shouldn't be dividing America internally that way. But most importantly, there are members of the multi-ethnic Chinese diaspora who live in these cities, who are from Taiwan, who are from Tibet, who are from Xinjiang, who are from a vast array of places, and inserting language that endorses PRC policy on issues with regard to territory and ethnicity in those sister city agreements is an insult to them, and it also makes them feel unsafe because their communities suddenly are allying with a government that in many instances they've experienced oppression from personally.
I would just add to that about the leverage points. I think even if there is a sister city agreement, one is to look at the fine print. And this goes to also some of the Confucius Institute agreements. Like part of it is just knowing what to, at that negotiation stage, what to say no to. But two, to realize at some point, there may be a member of one of these communities who comes before the town council or the city council and asks for a resolution for the Dalai Lama's birthday or to support something else or to talk about how, and you're gonna get a call from your sister city partner asking you to not support that resolution or the sister city relationship could be endangered. So I think that would be also being ready for that, being at the beginning to say, even if you pursue a sister city relationship, to say, we want you to understand that we have members in our community and we care about these causes and we will continue to speak out. If you can do that at the beginning, it's less likely they'll even try later on.
Thank you.
One last question, Mr. Kohler, I wanted to ask you this. I know the answer, but I wanted people to hear it. Let's suppose that someone acting as an agent on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party, but obviously won't declare themselves that way, picked up the phone and called a private investigator in any city in America and said, we are willing to pay you X amount of money to surveil, to collect as much information, create a pattern of life, gather as much information as you can about individual so-and-so, maybe a Chinese American who has spoken out against Chinese policies or a dissident who actually has been impacted by them and the like. That private investigator, if they don't know who the person calling on the other line is and just think it's an interested local party or what have you, would not be violating any federal laws. There's no federal, but yet sounds like an enormous loophole that can be exploited to hire people here to at least create the portfolio for harassment.
Senator, you're right. The Section 951 only outlaws aiding a foreign power if it's an illegal act. So that example would be a traditional commercial transaction. So a private investigator would be free to conduct surveillance on behalf of any foreign power that called them.
Okay. Thank you. Anything else? All right. Thank you for coming in today. I hope this was informative, and I'm glad we did it in an open setting like this. And again, thank you for your time. With that, the meeting's adjourned.